Oh wow, we're really doing a middle part. Millennial who? Ooh, that was much easier than it normally is. Almost like propeller. Oh. It's machine. Bonjour à toutes et à tous et bienvenue sur Blabla Katie. My name is Katie and today we're going to blah blah about tips on finding an apartment in France. On my most recent video in what I wish I had known before teaching English in France, you all gave me a ton of ideas for future videos, so merci beaucoup. One of the most popular requests was finding an apartment in France, voila. So I have some experience with trying to find apartments in France because a couple years ago when I was part of TAPIF, or the teaching assistant program in France, I was not provided an apartment through the school that I was working with. Sometimes that is the case, but it was not the case with me. And I'm actually now looking for an apartment again because I will be moving back to France in the fall. So for this video, the majority of the tips that I'm giving you are what I've already acquired from my past experience, but since I'm also currently in the process of searching for an apartment in France, I figured I'm actually going to make videos that show you in real time me putting these tips into practice. And this way you'll be able to see maybe what's particular to finding an apartment in France mid-pandemic. So if you don't want to miss my future videos that are going to show you in real time what it is like to be looking for an apartment in France, make sure you subscribe. And let's get started. All right, finding an apartment in France can be very tricky. And the reason why is because French landlords are looking for a very specific type of tenant. Usually these tenants are French and have a long-term salaried position and are making a salary that I believe is 3 times the amount of what the monthly rent is. So if you're watching this video, you most likely are a foreigner to France. Probably you are in a short-term contract, if anything, or you might be freelancing and just want to move to France. If you're still in the stage of trying to find a job in France, I recommend that you check out my video on how to find a job in France after the pandemic. I will put the link in the description box below. And finally, if you do have a job in France, most likely as part of TAPIF, or maybe as a lecteur d'anglais or maître de langue, you are not making that much money. So it's really hard to fit even just these 3 criteria, which are not exhaustive, for what a French landlord is looking for in a tenant. That being said, I do want to inject a little bit of positivity here and just state that I actually had the easiest time getting an apartment. And I know that my experience is not going to be the same for everyone, but it is possible that you'll have a really easy time finding an apartment and it'll be a breeze. If not, don't worry, there are tips in this video to help you. First things first, you must absolutely ignore the urge to commit to something before you're even in France. And you absolutely never want to send money beforehand. And I do say 99% of the time you should make sure that you physically see an apartment before committing to it, because the other 1% of the time is actually how I found my own apartment in France during TAPIF. So back in 2017, I actually secured an apartment for the whole duration of my stay in France about 2 weeks before I arrived. I committed beforehand, but I did not send any money. It did work really well in my favor, but that's specifically because I was going through a trusted source. The person who I was renting from was actually another teacher in the school who was referred to me by my lead teacher. And when the teacher told me how much the apartment would be per month, I was able to compare this price with other apartments in the area by going online on certain websites, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And I could see that what she was actually telling me for the price was about the same as what I was seeing for other apartments, if not a little bit cheaper. And an added bonus, I didn't have to worry about putting together what's called a dossier. I will be talking about the dossier in a little bit as well, but for now, the most important thing to take out of that story is that networking is key. As soon as you know where you'll be living in France, you should reach out to anyone you know who is currently in France. Even if they're not in that specific city, you can ask them if they know anyone in those cities. You should also talk to anyone you know who used to live in France. If you are just graduating from university, then what you should do is reach out to the French department. These students have likely studied abroad in France, or might be from France, or most likely know people in France who they could reach out to. If you're a part of TAPIF, as soon as you know the school that you're staying in, and as soon as you have somebody's email, you should reach out to those people as well and ask if they could help you with housing. Like I said before, some schools for TAPIF will offer you housing, I think at a subsidized price, so that might also be an option. If you're taking a different job in France, you should ask somebody who's your point person, that's your supervisor or your other colleagues, and you should ask to be put into contact with anyone who has had your job previously, because they could also have some leads. And what you want to ask these people are simply if they know anyone or if they themselves are subletting a place, looking for an apartment, renting an apartment, things like that. And the more people that you reach out to, the better chances you have of finding something. Of course, you don't want to be too picky when you reach out to all of these different people. You don't want to list every single thing you're looking for in an apartment, but you should give a sort of outline of what you're looking for. So maybe just the price range and of course the location. That being said, you should still definitely have in your mind what it is you're looking for in an apartment. I recommend just writing down on a piece of paper a really long list of every single thing you could ever want in an apartment. Of course, you do have to recognize that you need to be realistic at some point, but for now, just write down everything that you want or need in an apartment. Once you've done that, then you should separate the two into what are non-negotiables, deal breakers, if the apartment does not have a washing machine, then I'm saying no, as well as negotiables, things that you would love to have, like a balcony, but that are not necessarily going to push you away if the apartment doesn't have that specific amenity. It's also super important as you're creating this list and as you're reaching out to your network of people to figure out what your price point is for an apartment. This is going to depend on your budget, your salary, and the place that you're going to be living in, just because the cost of living can be so different depending on where you are in France. So I unfortunately can't give you a specific breakdown of how much you should be putting towards your rent, but I can say that when I was in Tapif, I was looking for an apartment in more of a rural area, and I ended up paying 350 euros a month for, I believe the apartment was 25 square meters. It was big enough to have a kitchen that had a lot of natural light, as well as a bedroom and a bathroom. All of the extras were also included in that, like heat and electricity and water. But at the same time, now that I'm looking for an apartment in Paris, I can't find anything for less than 700 euros in an apartment that is the size of a closet. So really, it's going to depend on where you are. I found it really helpful when I'm trying to figure out how much money I can allot towards an apartment when I think about my budget holistically. And I think about all of the different things that I will have to cover with my monthly salary. So things like food, transportation. If you want more guidance specifically on the finances of moving to and living in France, let me know and I can definitely do a video that has more to do with saving up for France and the cost of living in France, how to save in France and things like that. And once you come up with your price range for the apartment, you also need to be aware that sometimes the price that is advertised is not going to be the price altogether. There are often hidden costs, heat, electricity, internet. You need to really be careful and see if these are included or not, because if they're not, this is going to be an additional charge. You will also have to pay what's called a habitation tax. I didn't actually have to pay this because, again, the way that I found an apartment was not really through an official channel, so we didn't necessarily do the most official things. But normally you will have to pay a habitation tax in January. You will definitely want to ask how much that costs. There's also renter's insurance. And finally, if you go through an agency to find an apartment, which I do not recommend, then you will have to pay them a fee as well. So when you come up with your price range, just be aware that when you're looking at apartments, you might actually have to look for something that is cheaper than your price range, so that once you add all of these extra hidden costs, you're not going above your price range. In addition to the price point, what you'll want to think about when you're coming up with your list of negotiables and non-negotiables are things like the size of the apartment, of course the location, for example, how close or far it is to where you'll be working, if you want to be on a specific floor, if you want it to have certain amenities, and if you want it to be furnished or not. And most often you should be looking for furnished apartments. These will be a little more expensive than non-furnished, but then you won't have to worry about paying for furniture. So as you're coming up with your negotiables, your non-negotiables, your price point, you will also want to start turning towards online websites. You can go to places like Le Bon Coin, Se Loger, PAP, and I've also heard about Craigslist in France and Appartager, but I think that Appartager is solely if you're looking for roommates. There's also an app that I recently found that is super helpful because it kind of just pulls every single posting from all the different websites and puts them into one place. It's called Jinka. On the other hand, you can also go through agencies to try to find an apartment. I've heard that it can be difficult to do so because a lot of times they will also be asking for specific criteria that oftentimes foreigners just cannot meet. But if you are able to go through an agency, I honestly wouldn't recommend it because of that extra fee. And also I would say to really avoid any sites that are specifically in English. And the reason why is because since they know that you are are a foreigner and they know that you don't speak French, you therefore are going to get ripped off. The apartments on these sites are way more expensive than what the apartment would be if it were just listed on a normal site with the assumption that French people are going to be looking at the listing as well. So stay away from all English sites, and I would recommend not going through an agency. So when you go onto these sites or in these apps, definitely use the filters. I honestly think that you should just start by putting in your non-negotiables, because then it'll be a really good reality check to see if what you're looking for actually exists and what sort of amenities you can get for the price point that you're looking for. And I cannot stress this enough, do not, under any circumstances, look at apartments that are way out of your price range. Don't even do it for fun. Just don't do it. If after putting in your price point and your non-negotiables, you see that there are quite a few listings in your search results, then at that point, I would say to put any of your negotiables into the filters. So as you're getting a feel for this, and as your date approaches to actually arrive in France, you should also start preparing your dossier, or at least what you can of your dossier. So a dossier is pretty much a file of all of these different documents that a French landlord is likely going to ask for. And once again, this is something that I just did not have to worry about. So I'm going to go off of the research that I did, and you are going to see in future videos me in real time trying to figure out how to get all of these different documents. But you will need a photocopy of your passport, your visa. If you're married, you're going to need a copy of the marriage certificate. You'll also need last year's tax return, 3 months of bank statements with the rent payments being highlighted, proof of employment, which would be the last 3 payslips or an employment contract, a certificate from your bank stating that you are a good client, and a letter from what's called a garant. So before we go further, I want to back up for a second and say that any document that is in English, say for the passport, should be translated into French. I know, France is wild with its paperwork. And on top of needing to translate your documents, I've also read that your proof of employment and your certificate from the bank should be from France. This is kind of difficult because if you're just moving to France, of course you don't have the 3 most recent payslips. In this case, this is when you would use the employment contract. As for the bank, that's what's a little trickier. I personally would say to make sure that you get the certificate from your bank in the United States or in whatever country you're in, and then to translate that to French. So you at least have something, and then when you're in France, really work on opening a French bank account. If you remember from my last video on what I wish I had known before teaching English in France, you heard me say that in France, you need proof of residency before opening a bank account. So this is something, once again, you're gonna see me go through it in real time. As I work on a solution to that, I will keep you posted. And now to go back to the letter from a garant. This is pretty much somebody who vouches for you and says, yes, if this person doesn't pay their rent, I will step in and pay the rent. So this is insurance for the landlord that even if you're not paying your rent, they are going to get their money. The problem with this is they often want the garant to be French. I have heard of people who have just used their parents or other people that they know outside of France as their garant, but there's also this website that I found called Garant Me, and this is a company that will be your garant for you. You do have to pay a fee. I'm not sure how much it is. I've heard that it's around 300, but again, something that you will likely see me doing in real time. I don't know, we're gonna figure it out together. So if you do find a garant that is not this website, then you're going to need documentation from them as well. Namely, their ID, their employment contract, their last 3 payslips, and their last tax declaration. So that is the dossier. That is the dossier. You also want to make sure that you definitely have accommodations for when you land in France. So normally when I go to France, I rely on hostels because they're cheaper and I like meeting people. But to be perfectly honest, because of the situation with the pandemic, I would really recommend going with an Airbnb. And an added bonus for Airbnb is you actually may be able to find permanent housing this way. So once you book an Airbnb, I've actually heard of people who will reach out to their hosts and ask them if they would be open to renting to them long term. Of course, it's really going to depend on the host, but it can't hurt to try finding an apartment that way as well. So finally, once you're getting closer and closer to your moving date to France, and definitely once you are in France, that's when you should start contacting landlords and owners to see if and when you can visit a specific apartment. After this step, once you find a landlord who has responded to you and who has told you when and where you can see this apartment, then you actually get to go. Definitely brush up on your French. Practice out loud, preferably with somebody else. Role play a situation in which you're asking questions about the apartment, and when you're answering questions questions about yourself as a potential tenant, or if you have to explain any weird situation, for example, the fact that you might not have a bank account open yet and things like that. To that effect, let me know in the comments if you want to know specifically what to say, what to ask, what to expect for questions, and I can do a whole video on that. If you can, you should definitely bring a French friend. It's just a really good idea to bring someone along who can step in if you miss something or if you have no idea what's going on. If you know in advance the certain apartments that you're going to see, you should definitely scope out the neighborhood, see how you feel in them, because of course you're not just going to be hopefully living in your apartment. You will be out in the world as well. So that's something else to keep in mind. If and when you get an apartment and you sign the contract, make sure you read through that contract carefully. Send it to someone you know who is a native French speaker, who can look through it and make sure there's nothing weird going on. And make sure if you have any questions that you ask them before you sign the contract. So those are all my tips on finding an apartment in France. If there's anything else you want to know, please put them in the comments down below. As always, if you got any value out of this video, please do give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. And that's all for now. À la prochaine!